When Ramana spoke about tracing the I, most people imagine following thoughts backward, analyzing where they come from, or watching the mind until it becomes quiet. That sounds reasonable. It sounds like what a spiritual practice should look like, but that's not what he meant. This subtle misunderstanding is why so many sincere practitioners feel stuck. They're doing something that looks like self-inquiry, but it's pointed in the wrong direction. Let me explain exactly where the confusion lies and what Ramana was actually pointing to. The most common interpretation goes something like this. A thought appears, so you watch it. You try to trace it back to where it came from. You follow the chain of thoughts, looking for some origin point, some source location in the mind. Maybe you imagine thoughts arising from a silent space, and you try to observe that space, or you watch the gaps between thoughts, waiting for insight. This approach feels productive. It feels like you're doing something. You're observing, analyzing, tracking mental activity with careful attention. And because it requires focus and patience, it feels like real spiritual practice. But here's the problem. All of this keeps attention on thoughts. You're still dealing with mental content, just in a more refined way. You're watching the parade go by instead of joining it, but you're still watching the parade. Ramana wasn't asking you to become a better observer of thoughts. He wasn't interested in thought management or mental silence techniques. The instruction to trace the I points somewhere else entirely. Here's the correction that changes everything. Tracing the I is not tracing thoughts. It's tracing the sense of being the thinker. This distinction is subtle, but it's everything. Thoughts come and go constantly. That's their nature. They appear, they dissolve, new ones arise. But notice something else. There's a felt sense that these thoughts are happening to someone. There's a felt sense of, I am thinking. That I that seems to own the thoughts, that seems to be having the experience. That's where Ramana points attention. Not to the thoughts themselves, not to the content of the mind, not to the silence between thoughts, but to the sense of I that appears to be present throughout all of it. When a thought arises, there's an automatic assumption that it's your thought. There's an immediate sense of, I am worried, or I am remembering, or I am planning. Ramana is asking you to notice that sense of I directly. The thought itself is secondary. What matters is the one who seems to claim the thought. So what does this actually look like in practice? This isn't about adding a new technique. It's about shifting where attention rests. A thought appears. Instead of following the thought or watching its content, you notice the sense of I that the thought seems to belong to. You're not analyzing this. You're simply noticing the felt sense of being a thinker. When attention shifts this way, the content of thoughts becomes less relevant. You might still have thoughts, but attention is no longer invested in them in the same way. There's a subtle turning inward. It's more like recognition than achievement. And here's what often surprises people. The mind may not become quiet. Thoughts may continue appearing. That's fine. Ramana wasn't asking for silence. He was asking you to notice who seems to be present, regardless of whether thoughts are arising or not. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for tracing the I to be correct. There's no special experience you should be waiting for, no blinding insight, no sudden silence. The practice is simply this turning of attention toward the sense of I itself. Sometimes it feels like nothing is happening. That's usually a good sign. The mind expects fireworks, expects confirmation, expects something to show for its effort. But self-inquiry doesn't feed the mind's need for feedback. It simply redirects attention to its source. Ramana often spoke of holding on to this I sense, staying with it until it naturally subsides. He described this as the I going back to its source in the heart. You don't try to dissolve the I, you simply hold attention there. By holding, I don't mean gripping or forcing, I mean letting attention rest there. The subsiding happens on its own, through sustained attention rather than through effort to make something happen. Now, there's one common mistake that derails many practitioners. Once people understand that attention should rest on the sense of I, they often try to grip it. They make it into an object of concentration. They strain to maintain it. This seems logical. If attention should be on the I, then surely keeping it there steadily must be the goal. But this effort itself creates a problem. The moment you try to hold the I through tension, you've turned it into something to be grasped. You've made it an object. And in doing so, you've subtly created a new subject, a new I that is doing the grasping. Now, Ramana did speak of fixing the mind steadily, of sticking to the I thought to the exclusion of other thoughts. So some steadiness is absolutely appropriate. The distinction is between steadiness and strain. Steadiness means gently returning to the I sense, letting it be the only thought that remains. Strain means tensely holding on as if the I might escape. One is natural attention, the other is effortful gripping. When attention rests on the sense of I, it doesn't need to be forced. It's simply noticed and held gently. If attention wanders to other thoughts, no problem. Notice that there's now someone who wandered. Notice the sense of I that seems to have become distracted. The wandering itself becomes an opportunity, not a failure. You simply return to that one thought, the I thought, and let other thoughts fall away. Let me be clear about what this video is not trying to do. I'm not giving you a new method. I'm not adding steps to your practice. If anything, I'm removing something, removing a false understanding of what Ramana meant. The instruction to trace the I is already complete. It doesn't need elaboration or technique. What it needs is accurate understanding. Most confusion comes not from the practice being difficult, but from the practice being pointed at the wrong thing. When you think tracing the I means watching thoughts, you can do that for years without much shifting. But when you understand that it means noticing and holding on to the sense of being a thinker, following that I sense back toward its source, the practice immediately becomes simpler and more direct. Ramana pointed to the heart as this source, the place where the ego I arises and to which it returns. You don't need to visualize this or locate it physically. The tracing itself, the sustained attention to the I sense, naturally leads attention inward. There's nothing to add. There's only this subtle correction in direction. For now, let this settle. The practice of tracing the I is not about thoughts. It's about the one who seems to think them. Hold on to that sense of I and let it subside into its source. That one correction may be all you need. Now, when people try this, something else often happens. The sense of I seems to disappear. You look for it and you can't find it, and people think they've failed. That's what I'll talk about in the next video.